I'm Katrina, and let me start by showing you a classic example of a perceptual task used to study the neural basis of decision-making. So we have our monkey fixating at the center of the screen, and we present him with a field of randomly moving dots, and his task is to decide whether these dots move more to the left or more to the right. And at the same time, we can record from visual neurons selective for motion direction. And one common observation for such neurons is that their activity is correlated with the animal's decision in this task, which is what I show here. So if we take trials where the stimulus presented was identical, and we look at the spike count for a given neuron, which I show on the y-axis here, and then split that by the choice the animal made, shown by the different colors, then we see this systematic relationship between the activity of the neuron and the choice that the animal has made. And this decision-related activity has been quantified as choice probability or choice correlation. And importantly, it's unexplained by the stimulus because it occurs in response to repeated presentations of an identical stimulus. And there are two classes of explanation put forth to account for this activity. The original feed-forward account suggests that decision-related activity reflects the causal effect of correlated sensory noise on the choice. But there's a growing body of evidence for a feedback component to this activity. And this could, for example, be an expectation or a belief about the stimulus, which then feeds back and influences the activity of the sensory neurons. And this idea can be formalized in an inference framework, which has recently been linked to the activity of sensory neurons, which is essentially what we're showing here. And in this framework, feedback reflects a belief about the stimulus. And importantly, this feedback is task-specific. So that means that in a feature discrimination task, like the one I showed you for motion, that the feedback is therefore feature-selective. So in our example case, this would be a belief about the stimulus, the motion direction of the stimulus, so whether it's left or right. So in the inference framework, if we have a feature discrimination task, feedback is feature selective. We can then hypothesize that this feature selective feedback may engage the same mechanism as that in feature attention, which has been studied extensively in a largely independent line of research. And in order to test this hypothesis, we can leverage the knowledge we have from the study of feature attention in order to make a testable prediction. So one characteristic of feature attention is that it affects neurons with a preference for the attended feature throughout the entire visual field, so it's acting globally. And this was found, for example, by Troy and Martinez-Trujillo. And if we take advantage of this global characteristic, we can make the prediction that if the feedback component of decision-related activity and feature attention engage the same mechanism, then decision-related activity should also be found globally. That means also for neurons that represent task-irrelevant stimuli that have no bearing on the choice, which may seem counterintuitive, which is why I'll walk through this prediction in a bit more detail. So in a feed-forward framework, we have our task-relevant stimulus, which the monkey uses to make his decision, and the activity of neurons representing this stimulus support the choice that the animal makes. But then we can also introduce a task-irrelevant stimulus. And the animal should not use this stimulus to make his decision and should ignore it. And if he is ignoring it, then there should be no connection between the activity of neurons representing this task-irrelevant stimulus with the choice. And that means that we would therefore expect the activity of neurons used to inform the choice to be correlated with the choice, which is the classic finding. But we would not expect this correlation with choice for the neurons that are not used to inform the choice. That is, for neurons representing a task-irrelevant stimulus. Now, if we look at the inference framework, we have our task-relevant stimulus, but now we have two influences on the activity of the sensory neurons, the stimulus and the belief. And again, we introduce our task-irrelevant stimulus that the monkey should be ignoring, and therefore the activity of the neurons representing the stimulus should again have no connection with the choice. Now, if we incorporate the one key characteristic of feature attention, that it's global, with this inference framework, then all neurons with a preference for the task-relevant feature will be affected by the belief. including those which represent a task-irrelevant stimulus. Which means we would not only see a correlation with choice for neurons representing the task-relevant stimulus, but also for neurons representing the task-irrelevant stimulus. And this is exactly what we predict. So we should find activity correlated with choice for those neurons representing a task-irrelevant stimulus that the monkey is not using to make the decision. And now I'll tell you how we tested this prediction. So, in our task, the monkey did a disparity discrimination task where he has to judge whether the central portion of a random dot stimulus was near or far with respect to the surround. And we then added noise to the stimuli to manipulate task difficulty, and included 0% signal trials where there's no correct choice defined and the animal's rewarded randomly on 50% of trials. Then in the task, he's cued to attend to one or the other hemifield, so the spatial attention task, and 2 stimuli appear simultaneously, 1 in each hemifield, for a fixed duration of 2 seconds. And the stimulus uses the monkey uses the stimulus in the cued hemifield to make his decision, so that's the task-relevant stimulus, whereas the stimulus in the opposite hemifield is task-irrelevant. And this stimulus was statistically independent of the relevant stimulus and uninformative about the choice, so the best strategy for the monkey is to completely ignore it. We then presented him with choice targets with near and far positions randomized, and he makes his choice with a card to the corresponding target. And whilst this hopefully seems straightforward to all of you, it's not very easy for the monkey. But once he is trained up on it, we could record from activity in disparity selective sites in area V2, and we did this with multi-channel probes. Now, what I briefly mentioned, which is quite important here, is to successfully test our prediction of finding decision-related activity for neurons representing a task-irrelevant stimulus, we need to be sure that the monkey is, in fact, ignoring this task-irrelevant stimulus. And we first looked at his behavior to confirm this. So here I show the performance as percent signal against percent far choices made, where the relevant stimulus is red and irrelevant is blue. And what we see is that for the task-relevant stimulus, the choice systematically depends on the stimulus. So we have more far choices for higher far signal and vice versa for near. But we don't see this for the task-irrelevant stimulus, where the performance is flat, suggesting he's correctly using the task-relevant stimulus to inform his decision, but he's ignoring the task-irrelevant stimulus. In addition to this, we did a psychophysical reverse correlation, where we basically did this to examine how the monkey used the stimulus throughout its presentation. And here you see for the task-relevant stimulus, this characteristic structure to the kernel that shows or indicates a systematic relationship between the stimulus and the choice. Whereas we don't see this systematic relationship for the task-irrelevant stimulus, where the kernel is essentially random and the amplitude around 0. So overall, we have good behavioral evidence that the monkey is ignoring this task-irrelevant stimulus. But what's nice is that in addition to this behavioral evidence, we also have a neural signature. So here we look at the firing rate for an example unit as a function of percent signal. And what we see for the task-irrelevant stimulus is that the firing rate is drastically reduced for this stimulus compared to the relevant stimulus. And this is a well-known effect of spatial attention. And we see this effect across the population, which suggests he's correctly attending the task-relevant stimulus, but not the task-irrelevant one. Which means we can go ahead and test our prediction of finding decision-related activity for this ignored task-irrelevant stimulus. So we measured decision-related activity by taking the firing rate on 0% signal trials and separating this by what the choice the animal made, so near or far. And we see for the task-relevant stimulus this characteristic difference in firing rate as a function of choice, signifying decision-related activity. And we quantify this as choice probability, where values above 0.5 signify a positive correlation between the activity and the choice. So this is the classic finding. We're able to replicate it for this example. But now we turn to our prediction. And it's worth remembering here that given that he is ignoring this task-irrelevant stimulus, that in a feed-forward framework, we would not expect to find choice probabilities for neurons representing this stimulus, but it would be predicted by feature attention. And it's exactly what we find. So we find significant choice probabilities for this ignored task-irrelevant stimulus. And we don't just find this for our example, but we find it to be highly consistent across the population. We also found a correlation between the values across task conditions. And surprisingly, the means for the task-irrelevant stimulus are just as large as those for the relevant stimulus. So here we find significant decision-related activity for neurons that represent a stimulus we know the monkey is ignoring, so it's incompatible with the feed-forward framework. But as I said, it's predicted by feature attention. So in summary, we find decision-related activity for an ignored stimulus, which is incompatible with the feed-forward framework, but is predicted if feature attention and the feedback component of decision-related activity share the same mechanism. And this is compatible with the inference framework. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks for your attention, to the lab and my funding, and to Cosyne for accepting my abstract.
Time for questions.
Yeah, very nice talk.
Thank you.
Isn't there an alternative explanation in a feed-forward framework where the neurons that are the unattended stimuli are correlated with the other ones?
So the stimuli are on different hemispheres. So in a feed-forward framework, I wouldn't see any reason that they should be correlated in this way.
Okay, thank you.
I had the same question.
Okay.
So just follow up on that question. So you said you have measured, like in a situation where the animal's not performing the task, if you put the two stimuli, there is no correlation between the fine rate of the neurons associated with the putative relevant and irrelevant stimuli?
I mean, so we've only run the monkey on the task, so he's always doing this feature discrimination. So you mean if he's just has two stimuli there, but he's not doing any task, or?
What I mean is that the fact that you find choice probability in the irrelevant neurons does mean that they're correlated.
Yes.
So the question is this correlation going to explain the effect? Therefore, it needs another condition to measure that correlation. Any other condition that you know whether this correlation can exist from feed-forward signals?
I mean, I wouldn't like to posit. So far, I mean, what we predicted was based on this model, like based on an idea that makes sense that this feedback is task-specific. So I think the prediction follows a clear logic. So I would find it difficult to then suggest another feedback mechanism that could be performing this without postulating randomly.
Thank you. You have a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, late question.
Sometimes choice probabilities show up before the stimulus appears. Did you look for that? Was it true on
So we haven't looked at the temporal profile of it yet, but that could well be possible. So for example, if you have this history dependence, so if the stimulus before was, he said near, then the next one he might be more likely to say far. So it could be that that belief could then influence the activity even of the task-relevant neurons and then push in that direction. But we haven't looked at the temporal profile yet.
Thanks.
Okay, let's thank the speaker.